Yeah, so I just want to revert to that, Vixelian discussion of inflation that we mentioned previously. So what I'd like to try to do actually from beginning is I'd like to try to draw all these different threads together now. So I've called this economic growth, trade, public finance, and the paradox of thrift. So what I think we can do now is we can generate two alternative theories of economic growth. That is to say, we're going to develop two generic growth equations, each of which will include the trade balance, the primary budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, and the domestic investment savings balance. The first one is going to be what I call a Keynes-type theory. This will validate such controversial issues that fiscal expansion leads to growth. It will validate the idea that investment drives savings, not the other way around, the paradox of thrift. Also, it will validate the idea, if we're thinking about the case of China then, that a trade surplus leads to growth, which I call, this is my term for it, monetary mercantilism. Then we can also identify a classics type theory, which does have advocates amongst our group here. I would suggest that that yields anomalous results and does not provide a solid foundation for the classical theories of trade, savings, or public finance. So real value added or real GDP is just given by our usual GDP equals consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, plus net exports. And obviously throughout this course anyway, we've been primarily interested in the growth rate of the expression, that is lowercase y, which is simply the growth rate of real GDP. Now, how can we derive the Keynes-type growth theory? This is the one that brings in the paradox of thrift and all of that kind of thing. Well, actually, it can be derived by adding a lagged consumption function. This is just, in a way, a very straightforward Keynesian consumption function. But it was Hick's idea that it should depend on lagged income rather than current income. And so if I do that, C0 is the intercept term in the consumption function, autonomous spending, if you will. C sub 1 is the marginal propensity to consume out of lagged disposable income. And obviously, Y lagged minus T lagged is disposable income of the previous period. So all that's really being suggested, we're not here worrying about whether investment equals savings or that kind of issue. We're saying that the people base their consumption decisions on the income that they had last period, which is again, a behavioral hypothesis. We have to, at this point, make a distinction between what the post-Keynesians, and there are great debates amongst post-Keynesians, Kaleckians, Mark Levar, who we've mentioned today, has been a primary contributor to this literature, about the difference between what is called capacity creating and non-capacity creating autonomous expenditure. We then divide through by lagged output. We're going to define, as we've done already, lowercase g to be equal to g over y, lowercase x is x over y, and so forth. Recall that y is growth. We can work through the different expressions, take logs, and we end up with the Keynes-type growth equation. And what does equation 8 say? Equation 8 says that growth occurs when, firstly, total autonomous spending as a percentage of GDP is greater than the marginal propensity to save. Because we're not questioning that investment equals savings here, like ex post. This is the total autonomous spending as a percentage of GDP and it has to be greater than the marginal propensity to save. If so, there will be growth. Growth occurs if there's a primary budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. Growth occurs if there's a trade surplus as a percentage of GDP, hence monetary mercantilism. Now, they don't all have to occur together, obviously. One can be going in one direction, one can be going in another direction, but that's where that's the Keynesian growth equation. As Frederick has kept stressing, this is the kind of thing that makes sense in terms of the real political economy of the real world. I mean, in the theory of free trade, we're told that we should aim for what? Trade balance, I suppose. In the real world, the mercantilist player du jour, if China is the mercantilist player du jour, has rapid growth. I mean, everyone knows instinctively that, if we're in a recession, we unbalance the budget. I mean, the government of Canada has done specifically that and got through the recession. Again, neoclassical economics would not allow that to occur. And this is the sense in which total spending, autonomous spending, leads saving. And yet at the same time, we can maintain the investment savings identity. I think it is useful to reconcile that Keynesian growth equation and the sectoral balances, typical sectoral balances equation. What the growth equation says is that the total autonomous spending of GDP, if that is greater than the marginal propensity to save, that will lead to growth. In short, equations 10 and 11 are consistent with one another. Now, what about the classics type theory? Well, I hit on this way of deriving a generic classics type theory by going back to the Harrod-Domar growth formula from the 1940s, which in the notation I use, may I just finish in the notation I use, lowercase y is the growth rate, S is the average propensity to save, and I'm going to be using the symbol O to stand for capital output ratio. In the actual Harrod equation, I forget what it was S over C or something like that. But anyway, you were going to have a question then.
I would like to make a question about the Keynesian model. The investment was all autonomous, wasn't it? As the exports, for instance.
Yes.
So what happened to the rate of capacity utilization, the model, if the investment and the export grows at different ratios? How you can correct it?
Well, actually, that issue comes in this Harrod-Domar model. Oh, there's actually on the website of this of the Fields Institute is that exchange between Mark Lavoie and Peter Scott. Yeah, which deals exactly with these issues. So I mean, I do recommend having a look at that. Now, Harrod, of course, thought that this was a contribution to Keynesian economics, arguing precisely on these grounds of capacity utilization that the equation is an unstable equilibrium, the famous knife edge. Okay? However, if this appeal to a special case does not hold up, I would say the equation actually takes a big step backwards from Keynes into the world of classical economics, capital theory, and indeed into worlds where we worry about, capacity utilization. Because if you push all of that to one side and just look at what the equation says, what does the equation actually says? On the face of it, equation 12 actually says that when the savings propensity increases, growth increases. The opposite to the Keynesian view about the paradox of thrift. Also, as we stressed all along, that technical innovation will increase growth. Now, you see, Harrod thought that he could make the thing unstable by the mechanisms to which I think you implicitly refer. I'm saying that as soon as you write down this equation, you've kind of just stepped straight back into the classical world. And really, if you just look at this thing on its face, you know, you're back to must be saving in order for there to be growth. So let's work out a classic types growth theory using exactly those standard capital theoretic terms. And oddly enough, you come up with something like this. You don't come out with, you know, y equals s over o. In our lowercase notation, the classics type growth equation comes out like this. And as I say, it gives strange results as far as I can say. You've still got the idea that an increase in savings will increase growth, but you have here an idea that a budget surplus would lead to increase in growth. Now, it's not that you can't come up with an argument in favor of that. I mean, if saving is a good thing, why doesn't the government just save as well? Why don't we all save, in fact, and not have, why don't we all save 100% and not have any economy at all? Because saving is a good thing, am I right? A trade deficit leads to growth. Well, I mean, again, I've never really heard that before. What I usually hear from trade theory is that you know, growth should be balanced, basically, and everyone gains from trade, even if growth is balanced. Again, I mean, you can take the Milton Friedman line, and you can say he was talking in a day when the Japanese automobile market was strong, and he said the Japanese send us cars, and we send them bits of paper with a picture of Lincoln or some president on them. Isn't that a great deal? And yes, it is a great deal. And I suppose that's the logic behind this. But, you know, you're not going to get that deal in the real world, as a matter of fact. So that it's peculiar, anomalous type results. Now, of course, as we all know, the conventional wisdom on economic policy does not usually argue for an actual budget surplus just to avoid deficits. Nor do they actively argue for a trade deficit. You know, they don't argue that we want to sort of, you know, rip off the rest of the world entirely. Rather, it's usually assumed effectively that government spending as a percentage of GDP should equal the average tax rate, that there should be budget balance. It's just a good thing in and of itself. And also that exports equals imports. External balance, as the term goes, is also just a good thing. So you see, what usually happen is that you simply just say that what we're aiming for actually is budget balance, and what we're aiming for is external balance, in which case those two final terms drop out, and all you're left with is the supposed natural rate of growth, which is just Harrod's growth rate, interpreted now in a classical way. Obviously, we've introduced the average tax rate now, and if you think about it, this is the twist on the classical theory that was provided by the supply-side theorists in the 1970s. Effectively, no argument is offered as to why that seemingly perverse logic of budget surpluses and trade deficits should not apply. So I just want to leave that there. I don't know whether I'll fully go through the final slide, but I just want to let you know of its existence, shall we say. The final, and I presume that eventually these things will all be posted somewhere on the internet. We'll kind of make up final versions of this, and it'll get posted somewhere on the internet so people can, you know, go through them at their leisure. What I did here was simply talk about the alternative views of inflation, one of which we've discussed already, the Vixelian theory. Obviously, there's the simple quantity theory of money. The Vixel-type theory does, as some people have mentioned, take more accounts of endogenous money, bank credit creation, and so forth, but they, that insight is combined with a strict adherence to the so-called natural rate of interest. In the AMM, it's a good deal more complicated. There are Vixelian elements, you know, there are Keynesian elements. the third type of thing is cost push or conflict inflation. And I've just gone through a simple cost push or conflict inflation derivation here. I think we've actually almost come to the time, so I'm going to leave it there. I mean, maybe people have some additional questions to finish off with? Yeah.
I have a general comment, then going back to this thread of validation and methodology. So I like that you presented alternative views about all these different things. But I think the alternative views should still, you can't just decide beforehand which of the alternative views to toss out. So I'd like to propose the following thing, that what do you do before you go and test the model against reality? Well, logic is a somewhat powerful thing. If a model is logically inconsistent, then you toss it out. But that only takes you so far, because logical inconsistencies can often be remedied by change in assumptions and things like that. Okay. Accounting is also important. If the accounting is wrong, then you toss the model out. But also that can be remedied by defining new ways of bookkeeping. So once you do those things, you're still going to be left with a variety of models. And notice that I'm not including in the criteria for eliminating models things like micro-foundations. I don't think that's a valid way. If the model is not micro-founded, then you should toss it out. But conversely, I also don't think that if a model is micro-founded, then you should toss it out as well. So just keep them there. Okay. Now, how you decide between models? So you're proposing this abduction, which I think it's clever and important. Always reminds me of X-Files, but
it's not meant to.
But so as far as I understand, what is this abduction? Well, it's just like doing detective work, or court. You're trying to decide on a court case what side has more reasonable claim to what actually happens. So you don't know what actually happens. You can see a time series for interest rate, but so what? There is one sample path that actually happened in the past, but there's all sorts of circumstances around it. So then you go and you look at the data more and more carefully. So you start out with a variety of models, and then you toss out the ones that don't explain what actually happened. So that's looking at the past. And then now look, this works equally well for the future. You still don't know what's going to happen in the future. You start out with a variety of models that explain what you're seeing. And then as you go forward, evidence will accumulate, and some of those models will disappear, and some of those models will gain more prominence. Okay, so what I just described is Bayesianism. It's Bayesian method going both for something that happened in the past, because what happened in a courtroom, it's exactly a Bayesian discussion, and what's going to happen in the future. And someone mentioned Bayesian statistics yesterday, and I think that it's a perfectly ontologically valid way to deal with problems in social sciences. So that's all my...
No, point taken, and I'm actually glad for all of these responses that you've made, including yourself. I actually like your analogy of sifting evidence in the courtroom, but I do think that the criteria comes down to, once you've sifted all the evidence, sometimes there's only one possible explanation, and that's essentially what I mean by abduction. And if that's the method that you and I are both using, then I'm with that. This sort of statistical inference, looking at, confidence intervals and that kind of thing, doesn't seem to me to solve any issue. It's not adequate detective work, if you put it like that. I have to disagree with you on the micro-foundations, because one of the big issues that we've been talking about here is money, and the micro-foundations literature is just utterly weak on the issue of money. And indeed, it's not surprising, because if your premise is a model of barter exchange, whenever you introduce money into those micro-foundations model, money is always welfare unimproving. It's actually, the fictional area is the theory of barter exchange. What we're studying is, if you like, capitalism. That's what we're studying. We're not studying generic methods of provisioning, right? And you know, in those optimization models, there's something missing of the essential features of capitalism. There's certainly essential features of capitalism missing from what I've discussed.
But it's reality that's going to tell you that it's missing.
Yeah, well, I think we both end up being realists as opposed to idealists on one side and materialists on the other side. So at this point, I'll thank you all for the questions and discussions. And